The rain fell steadily over Hatfield Airfield on an otherwise quiet morning in early 1943. The war had entered a brutal and uncertain phase, and every corner of Britain seemed to vibrate with the weight of urgency. Deep inside the de Havilland design offices, a man stood hunched over a wide drafting table, his pencil racing across paper with fierce determination. This was Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., chief test pilot and son of the legendary aviation pioneer. For months, he had been living between two worlds, one in the air, where he tested the limits of new aircraft, and one on the ground, where he pushed the boundaries of what an airplane could be. But this project was different. It was confidential, ambitious, and perhaps the most dangerous assignment he'd ever accepted. The Royal Air Force had sent a request unlike any before. They wanted an aircraft faster than any Allied fighter, capable of outrunning even the feared Messerschmitt Me-262 jet in a dive. It had to be lightweight, long-range, and agile enough to fight its way deep into enemy territory. Above all, it had to be built quickly. The Mosquito had proven a triumph, but times were changing. The Luftwaffe was deploying newer, deadlier aircraft, and the RAF needed something revolutionary to counter them. Geoffrey placed his pencil down and exhaled. Before him was the first complete outline of a machine that would soon be known as the de Havilland Hornet. A super Mosquito, some engineers whispered. A miracle made of wood, others joked. But Geoffrey knew it would be something far more important. A weapon that might change the course of the air war, if only it could be built in time. He walked to the window and watched the rain streak against the glass. The world outside was grey, tense, expectant. Britain was already stretched thin, and every resource was rationed. Factories worked through the night. Young men were being trained into pilots at a pace unthinkable just 3 years earlier. Fuel, aluminum, rubber, everything was measured like gold. Yet the Hornet project received priority approval. Even in the midst of war, the Air Ministry understood. Speed and innovation would win the skies. In the months that followed, the factory became a rhythm of hammering, sanding, testing, revising, and starting again. Engineers argued over the angle of wings and the thickness of wooden layers. Mechanics reworked engine mounts until their hands blistered. And Geoffrey divided his time between overseeing the design and flying prototypes of other aircraft to keep his instincts sharp. One night in February 1944, after yet another 14-hour shift, he sat alone in the hangar, staring at the unfinished fuselage of the Hornet. Its smooth wooden skin gleamed faintly in the dim industrial light. It looked almost alive, like a predator waiting to leap. He ran his hand across the wing, feeling the cold curves. "This will be the fastest piston fighter the world has ever seen," he whispered. But he also knew time was slipping away. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Europe. Soon the skies over Normandy would be crowded with aircraft. Every delay risked lives. Every miscalculation would echo across the front lines. The engines, two powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin 130S, were finally delivered in April. Geoffrey supervised as the mechanics carefully integrated them into the sleek nacelles. When the last bolt was tightened, he stepped back and felt a rare surge of pride. The Hornet was ready. On the morning of July 28, 1944, surrounded by engineers, officers, and a handful of privileged observers, Geoffrey climbed into the cockpit. He adjusted his harness, ran his fingers across the familiar layout of the controls, and inhaled deeply. This was the moment every test pilot lived for. The engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the airframe and through his chest. Geoffrey gave a small nod to the ground crew as they stepped back. The Hornet began rolling. As the aircraft accelerated along the runway, Geoffrey felt the lift gather beneath the wings. With a gentle pull of the control column, the Hornet soared into the air. Everything changed. The aircraft sliced through the sky like a blade. Geoffrey pushed the throttle further, and the Hornet surged ahead with astonishing power. The controls were light, responsive, almost eager. He banked left, then right, testing the limits. Each movement was smooth, graceful. Then came the moment that stunned even him. He checked the airspeed indicator. 485 miles per hour. He blinked, looked again. No single-engine RAF fighter had ever come close. The Hornet was not just fast, it was astonishing. A machine ahead of its time. When Geoffrey landed, the engineers rushed toward him, eager for every detail. He opened the canopy, removed his helmet, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we've built something extraordinary." But his expression softened as he added quietly, "I only hope we're not too late." Outside, the sky had cleared. Sunlight spilled across the airfield, illuminating the Hornet as if revealing a hidden hero. Yet the war was already changing, accelerating toward its unpredictable end. The Hornet was ready for battle. But the world was not waiting. The success of the Hornet's first flight spread quickly through the halls of the Air Ministry. Reports were stamped confidential, yet circulated with unusual excitement. Britain had done the impossible. They had built a fighter that exceeded expectations at a time when expectations were already sky high. But the Hornet's greatest enemy was not the Luftwaffe. Its greatest enemy was the calendar. By late 1944, the war was shifting decisively in the Allies' favour. Germany was retreating on all fronts, and the RAF was increasingly focused on supporting ground operations for the coming liberation of Europe. The demand for new piston engine fighters began to decline as jet technology accelerated. German jet threats like the Me-262 worried commanders, but they also made it clear that the future was changing faster than anyone had predicted. Still, the Hornet underwent intensive testing. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. spent weeks pushing the aircraft to its limits at varying altitudes. At high speeds, the fuselage vibrated less than expected. At low speeds, it handled like a lightweight fighter. Its climb rate was exceptional. Engineers marveled as he delivered report after report filled with near-perfect performance data. The RAF began to form plans. If the Hornet could be deployed quickly, within months, it could serve as a long-range escort fighter for bombers, a fast reconnaissance aircraft, or even a night interceptor. Yet every plan faced the same obstacle: production time. The wooden structure, although ingenious, still required specialized craftsmen. Factories skilled in building Mosquito parts were stretched thin, repairing damaged aircraft daily. Engineering teams were exhausted, having worked through years of unending war. Even so, the Air Ministry pushed forward. By December 1944, the first pre-production Hornets were ready for advanced testing. Every time Geoffrey climbed into the cockpit, he felt both pride and pressure. He knew that the pilot who first took the Hornet into combat could have been him if the war lasted long enough. On a cold morning in early January 1945, Geoffrey conducted a high-speed, low-altitude run over the English countryside. The aircraft skimmed over fields and hedgerows like a streak of steel and wood. Villagers looked up, catching only a flash of silver as the Hornet roared overhead. As he gained altitude, clouds brushed against the wings like cotton. Geoffrey took a moment to appreciate the silent engineering brilliance beneath him. But his satisfaction was short-lived. The radio crackled. "Geoffrey, urgent news, return to base immediately." His heart tightened. Test pilots rarely heard those words unless something had gone wrong. He banked sharply and raced back. When he landed, a group of officers waited, their expressions grim. "Germany is collapsing faster than expected," one of them said. "By the time the Hornet is fully deployed, the war in Europe may already be over." The words hit Geoffrey harder than any physical blow. For nearly 2 years, he had poured his life into the Hornet. To imagine it standing idle during the war, it was built to fight, felt like betrayal. Not from the aircraft, but from time itself. Yet the project continued. The RAF insisted that even if the Hornet missed the European theatre, it could still play a major role in the Pacific. Japan remained a formidable opponent, and long-range missions across the vast ocean required exactly what the Hornet offered: speed, endurance, and reliability. The plan seemed promising. The first operational Hornet squadron was scheduled for final training by the summer of 1945. Engineers worked day and night. Pilots were introduced to the aircraft's handling characteristics. Manuals were prepared. And then history intervened again. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. Crowds filled the streets of London celebrating victory in Europe, waving flags and singing. Factories briefly paused their work as workers stepped outside to hear Prime Minister Churchill's announcement. But inside Hangar 5 at Hatfield, the atmosphere was different. The Hornet stood gleaming, perfect, silent. Test pilots and mechanics walked around it with bittersweet expressions. The war it was created to win was already over. Still, hope remained. Japan was still at war, and British forces were preparing for Operation Zipper, the planned liberation of Malaya and Singapore. The Hornet, with its range and speed, could have been a decisive tool in the campaign. But the world changed once more. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Within days, Japan surrendered. The Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was over. and the Hornet had never fired a shot. In the weeks following the war's end, Geoffrey walked through the now quiet airfields and listened to the distant hum of peacetime operations. The RAF had begun to shrink. Many aircraft that had been desperately needed for combat were now being retired or sold for scrap. Yet, the Hornet survived. Why? Because even in peace, its speed and capabilities were too valuable to ignore. The RAF recognized that the world was entering a new era, one shaped by political tension, colonial conflict, and the emerging Cold War. And in that uncertain landscape, a fast, long-range fighter still had a role to play. But Geoffrey felt the weight of disappointment. He had dreamed of seeing the Hornet tested against the best enemy fighters, proving itself in battle. Instead, it would enter service quietly, almost unnoticed. One evening in September, he sat beside the aircraft, the hangar lights casting long shadows across the floor. "It could have changed everything," he whispered. The Hornet, beautiful and silent, seemed to agree. It was an aircraft built for war, but delivered into peace. And its story was far from over. The post-war years transformed Britain. Cities once darkened by air raids lit up again. Factories that once produced weapons now turned to civilian goods. Soldiers returned home, and families rebuilt their lives in a slowly recovering nation. But not every airfield quieted down. At RAF Coltishall, a new sound began to echo across the runways in early 1946, the sharp, powerful hum of the de Havilland Hornet. The aircraft had finally entered operational service, nearly 2 years after its triumphant first flight. It arrived not as a machine of war, but as a tool for a new era of global responsibility. No, 64 Squadron was the first to receive it. Pilots who tested it came back with expressions of disbelief and admiration. One of them, Flight Lieutenant Harold Mason, described his first flight in simple words. It wasn't flying a fighter, it was flying the future. The Hornet accelerated down the runway faster than any piston aircraft they had flown. Its climb rate was breathtaking, its turns crisp, its controls balanced. Many pilots had flown the legendary Spitfire, but the Hornet felt like an evolution, sharper, cleaner, faster. And yet, it was 2 years late. Instead of facing Messerschmitts over Europe, the Hornet now flew patrols over the North Sea. Instead of escorting bombers over Germany, it escorted naval aircraft across peacetime skies. It intercepted unidentified aircraft, trained new pilots, and served in roles far from the battlefield for which it had been designed. But the world was not as peaceful as it seemed. In 1946 and 1947, unrest surged across several British colonies, and a new kind of conflict emerged, small, unpredictable, and far from Europe. The British government needed aircraft capable of long-range flights, quick deployment, and rapid response. And suddenly, the Hornet found its purpose. Malaya. A new battleground. In 1948, communist insurgents in Malaya launched attacks on plantations, railways, and local officials. The situation escalated quickly, and Britain found itself drawn into a long and complex counterinsurgency campaign. The tropical climate, dense jungles, and long distances made operations incredibly difficult. Many aircraft struggled with the heat, humidity, and need for sustained patrols. But the Hornet thrived. No, 33 and NUM-45 squadrons deployed to the region, bringing with them a fighter built for speed and endurance. Pilots flew low over the jungle canopy, scanning for hidden camps and supply lines. On some missions, they swooped down to drop bombs or launch rockets against insurgent hideouts. The Hornet's wooden structure reacted well to the humid climate, surprising engineers who had expected swelling or deterioration. Its twin Merlin engines handled the tropical conditions with resilience, and its speed, still unmatched by any piston fighter, gave pilots confidence during dangerous low-altitude runs. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no dogfights, no medals for aerial victories, but the Hornet was saving lives, providing essential support to troops fighting on the ground. And in doing so, it gained a quiet, steady respect. A tragedy in the sky. But the story of the Hornet cannot be told without acknowledging the sorrow that shadowed its legacy. On September 27, 1946, while testing a new Mosquito variant, Geoffrey de Havilland Jr was killed when the aircraft disintegrated during a high-speed dive. Britain lost not only one of its greatest test pilots, but also the man whose courage had brought the Hornet into existence. When the news reached the RAF squadrons operating the aircraft, many pilots felt the loss personally. Some placed small inscriptions inside their cockpits. For Geoffrey, fly it like he did. Built by courage. The Hornet, which he'd once described as extraordinary, became part of his legacy. The last years. By the early 1950s, jet fighters were rapidly replacing piston aircraft around the world. Meteor and Vampire jets became the new face of British air power. Commanders loved the Hornet, but military strategy was evolving. Speed now meant something different. Not 485 miles per hour, but 600, then 700. Still, the Hornet continued to serve with dignity. It supported operations during the Malayan Emergency, protected shipping routes, and flew maritime patrols. Even as jets screamed across the skies, the Hornet remained a reliable workhorse, swift, precise, and dependable. Pilots who transitioned to jets often said the same thing. "I'll miss the Hornet. It felt alive." But nothing lasts forever. In 1955, the RAF officially retired the last Hornet from frontline service. Most were scrapped. A few were used for technical experiments. None survived into the modern era. An aircraft that had once set records for speed. An aircraft that could have changed the course of late WWII. An aircraft that served with honour in forgotten conflicts. Quietly disappeared. A legacy rediscovered. Decades later, aviation historians began to rediscover the Hornet story. Old photographs resurfaced. Technical notes were preserved. Surviving pilots shared their memories of flying a machine that felt years ahead of its time. When asked what made the Hornet special, pilots often said, "It was perfect, but it belonged to another moment." And that was the truth. The Hornet was not a fighter that arrived late. It was a fighter that arrived at exactly the moment history moved on. Despite missing WWII, it proved its worth in the years that followed, flying dangerous missions over jungles, skies, and oceans where no other piston aircraft could match its performance. Today, aviation enthusiasts marvel at its sleek design, its wooden construction, and its astonishing speed. The Hornet is remembered not as a relic, but as a symbol of innovation, ambition, and human ingenuity, born from a nation fighting for survival. Its story is a reminder that greatness is not always measured in victories. Sometimes, greatness lies in potential, in what could have been, and in what was achieved despite the limits of time.